Hey everyone, hope you had a wonderful weekend. Welcome back to our study of Acts. Today we cover the very end of chapter 22 and are going into about halfway through chapter 23. So let's open with our prayer and we'll dive into today's text. Let the words of our mouths and the meditations of our hearts be always acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. All right, so let's go ahead and look at our lesson for today because it's pretty much from now, if you haven't figured this out yet, pretty much these last 6 chapters or so of Acts are pretty much just one continuous story that's being told, although clearly we've also sort of made the implied argument that Acts is one giant story of God's salvation at work in the world, which is absolutely correct. Really, these last few chapters are all about leading up to Rome. Here is where Paul's fate that decides how he will go to Rome is being played out in front of us. So we start today with chapter 22, verse 30, and we'll go through chapter 23, verse 11. So open your Bibles, your apps, or follow along here on the screen. Since Lysias wanted to find out what Paul was being accused of by the Jews, the next day he released him and ordered the chief priests and the entire council to meet. He brought Paul down and had him stand before them. While Paul was looking intently at the council, he said, "Brothers, up to this day I have lived my life with a clear conscience before God." The high priest Ananias ordered those standing near him to strike Paul on the mouth. At this Paul said to him, "God will strike you, you whitewashed wall. Are you sitting here to judge me according to the law, and yet in violation of the law you order me to be struck?" Those standing nearby said, "Do you dare to insult God's high priest?" And Paul said, "I did not realize, brothers, that he was high priest. For it is written, 'You shall not speak evil of the leader of your people.'" When Paul noticed that some were Sadducees and others were Pharisees, he called out in the council, "Brothers, I am a Pharisee, a son of Pharisees. I am on trial concerning the hope of the resurrection of the dead." When he said this, a dissension began between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and the assembly was divided. The Sadducees say that there is no resurrection, or angel, or spirit, but the Pharisees acknowledge all three. Then a great clamor arose, and certain scribes of the Pharisees' group stood up and contended, "We find nothing wrong with this man. What if a spirit or an angel has spoken to him?" When the dissension became violent, the tribune, fearing that they would tear Paul to pieces, ordered the soldiers to go down, take him by force, and bring him into the barracks. That night the Lord stood near him and said, "Keep up your courage, for just as you have testified for me in Jerusalem, so you must bear witness also in Rome." All right, so just a quick pick up from where we were last time that we gathered here. So Paul had been dragged to basically the entrance of the barracks to protect him from the crowd, although again he was put in chains for that because obviously from, we said, the Roman perspective, it must be his fault that all of this is taking place because they're all trying to get after him and beat him. But the tribune of the cohort recognizes that Paul, there's something more about Paul. He can speak a dialect of Greek that's not local to that area. He's from a fairly wealthy and prominent city of Tarsus. And then he gives this speech after the tribune allows him to where he, as we talked about, an apology, a classic rhetorical apology. And he has a very good speech that everyone's listening to. But until he says, "God has sent me to go far away to proclaim the message of the Gentiles," at which point then they come after him again, throwing off their cloaks, shouting, tossing dust into the air. that point's when the tribune brings Paul inside the barracks, flogs him, which was a common interrogation tactic, only to discover Paul speaks to one of his soldiers and says, "Do you dare to beat me, a Roman citizen who has been uncondemned yet, who has not had the opportunity to go to trial, essentially?" At which point, then the tribune, whose name again is Claudius Lysias, as we'll see in a couple of days, speaks to him, sort of incredulous that he is a full Roman citizen, thought of him as a citizen maybe on a lower level, but having the full rights and privileges of a Roman citizen, questions him, realizes that Paul is sincere in that. So they all, tribune, centurions under him, all pull back from Paul as they're getting ready to beat him because they don't want to get in trouble, which they would have substantially for allowing someone who was a Roman citizen to be abused or have his rights taken away from him under under arrest from Roman soldiers. Ironic, considering that if you didn't have that status as a Roman citizen, they could do pretty much anything they wanted to you, up to killing you, and even then they could pretty much find just very flimsy reasons to do that too. So where we pick up today is where the tribune, okay, so what's going on here is his question. Why are all of these Jews so mad? Why is this guy a lightning rod for all of this? So partially because he just wants to find out more, probably because, again, as his duty as a Roman soldier, he's bound to try to figure out how he can restore order in this situation. He released Paul and then convened the Sanhedrin. That sounds like a pretty thing out of his league as a tribune, but in fact, the Romans did have the authority to call local councils. Now, it had to be somebody who was fairly significant in authority, but a tribune who, as I said, commanded probably 1,000 to 1,200 soldiers was a fairly significant officer, and he had the authority to go to the high priest and say, "Y'all need to assemble, and you need to be able to figure out what's going on here, because otherwise we're going to fix this problem for you and you won't like the outcome." That's not what's here in the text, but that's probably how the script behind the scenes played out. So, with military escort, mind you, Paul is brought in front of the Sanhedrin. That wonderful council that we saw early on in Acts where Peter and John and the apostles were dragged in front of. But this time, while Peter and John, of course, were Jews, Paul's standing in front of this same council with a whole different set of credentials. Peter and John were just common, ordinary men, although renowned for the fact that they spoke and taught with great authority, just like their teacher and master Jesus. Paul not only speaks with this same authority, but he carries all of the other qualifications. He is a Pharisee. He has the education of a Pharisee, and he is probably recognized by some of the people who he used to serve with and work for, who remember his way of life in that regard. So Paul stands up in front of here with this very impressive resume as someone who is now under arrest, but yet was also one of them at one point in the not too distant past. So when Paul is brought before them, here's that expression in 23 verse 1. He looked intently at them. Remember that from way back when? Peter, when he saw the crippled man in the temple, looked intently at him. When they were in front of the Sanhedrin, Peter would look intently at those who were addressing him or challenging him and would proclaim the message to them with this very intense eye contact. And here is Paul doing the same thing, and he opens, and he's about to open again with seemingly another form of apology by saying, "Brothers, up to this day, I have lived my life with a clear conscience before God." Very likely he's about to go into the same spiel that he went through with all of the mob of Jews who was trying to beat him and kill him. And he was going to start, "I'm a Pharisee, blah, 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 blah." Even though some of these people would know that, likely would take a different tact because of the fact that some of them knew him. They certainly knew who he was by this point. But he starts off with this expression, Up to this day, I've lived my life with a clear conscience before God. And before he can get anything else out of his mouth, the high priest, who's now a man named Ananias, not the same Ananias, by the way, who was in Damascus, who laid his hands on Paul and healed his sight. This is not the same guy, same name, but different person. Ordered those to near Paul to strike him on the mouth. So Paul doesn't even get a chance to give his defense here. He says one comment. Now, in fairness, you use that expression to kind of see it from the perspective of the Sanhedrin. This idea of a clear conscience might have been offensive to the Jews for a couple of reasons. First of all, the idea of a clear conscience was actually more of a Greek idea at that time, which when you're bringing Greek ideas into a Jewish proceeding, it can be fairly offensive, especially when the mob just got agitated immensely because Paul had said something about going out and proclaiming the word to the Gentiles. And I mentioned offhand, and now we're starting to see a little bit more and more of this, that really what it comes down to, a lot of the anger of the Jews very likely is from this very nationalistic identity of their faith as Jews. In many ways, and eerily in many ways, sort of how Christian faith today is tied into a nationalistic perspective hand in hand with the United States. In both cases, for the Jews, they recognized that the nation of Israel, God's hand was in the formation of that. We very much recognize, and we can talk about the degrees to which this is true, but I think most people who are believers would admit that the founding fathers, for whatever their actual religious beliefs were, did have this sense that God's hand was in the creation of the founding of this nation. Nothing at all wrong. In fact, those are very important points to make when talking about the nation of Israel and the founding of the United States. Where that philosophy, where that theology goes astray, is when the state, the people of the nation of Israel or the nation of the United States, the nation that God has founded, can do no wrong because they are the nation that God has founded. And as such, that the only people that God really cares about are the people of that nation. Now, I don't think we quite think that part here today in our country, although there might be some. We certainly have a very national centered ethos, not that we don't care or God doesn't care about nations elsewhere, but certainly there's a very nation centered ethos in our country. But for the nation of Israel in this time, it was not only that we're very centered on our status as the nation of Israel, but God does not care about these people out here. They are Gentiles. They are beyond the salvation of God. That's how that it just had sort of twisted and warped and developed into that. And so Paul, with the mob and now with the official representatives of the Sanhedrin, all the elders of the council, he is standing there telling them this, and this nationalistic ethos is very much there. So he introduces this whole idea of a clear conscience, a very Gentile origin, and they immediately say, that's a Hellenist idea, get that out of here. The other part of that, though, is even if you take the Greek origin of that out for a clear conscience, which let me go back for that. I meant to say real quick, the idea of a clear conscience in Hellenistic culture was a philosopher with a clear conscience. It wasn't that they were morally justified. It was rather that you saw things the way they were, as opposed to the Hebraic or Judaic mindset that said that a conscience, if there was such a concept, which there really wasn't in this day and time, for Jews was the idea that you saw the world as needing God's redemption, that God had to choose people for redemption, and you had to live into the fullness of redemption. So again, you see the difference between the Hebrew idea of conscience, which was this fact that God has called us to live a certain way and we have to strive to do that, versus the Hellenist idea that if you were seeing the world for what it truly was, that itself was open to interpretation, you had a clear conscience. So just, I forgot to say that, wanted to make sure that was made clear. The other part of this is that here is Paul, throw out all of these images of conscience I just told you about. Here's Paul, a man who they have heard all these rumors about, that he is teaching and teaching Jews everywhere to forsake Moses. Don't worry about circumcision. Gentiles can come into the temple, all of this. And he says to them he has a clear conscience, a Gentile statement, and saying that he's done nothing wrong. Takes them off a little bit. Priest assistant smacks Paul on the mouth, and Paul's retort is, God will strike you, you whitewashed wall. Love that expression. Prophetic statement, though. It actually, the reference to that is out of Ezekiel chapter 13, and it had to do with Ezekiel, the prophet's condemnation of, ironically, the hypocrisy of Israel's leaders. Imagine that, by saying that they were a very weak structural wall that was slapped with a coat of white paint in order to disguise the fact that it was going to fall over at any minute. So here's Paul laying down some prophetic smack upon the people of the Sanhedrin, and then he goes into Levitical, dives into Levitical law. Important because here you have Sadducees here who only focus on the books of Moses, but then when he sits there, it says, are you sitting there to judge me according to the law, and yet in violation of the law you order me to be struck? Which was basically a condemnation within Levitical law that said the religious leaders who do not judge justly by the law shall be condemned by the law. So again, Paul's laying down two pretty significant retorts to the fact that he was smacked for saying that he had a clear conscience. And then this sort of incredulous thing that is said, people say, do you dare to insult God's high priest? And Paul says, I did not realize that he was high priest, for you shall not speak evil of a leader of your people. Well, he's correct in that prophetic part of that. He didn't recognize the high priest? Come on. Paul's a good Jew. He knows who the high priest is, even if he didn't know the person by sight, or even if he didn't know him by name, which was probably unlikely. He would know who was sitting where in that council. The high priest would likely have certain vestments on that would designate him. It's not like Paul didn't know who the person was. So why did he say that? Well, here's a good bit of Luke's storytelling at play here. He says it because while he might have seen the physical manifestation of the high priest wearing the proper robe, sitting in the right seat, a la think of Jesus saying those who sit in seats of honor and have their places of honor in the synagogues, those kind of things, but yet do not really know my name. Paul didn't recognize him in this sense, at least in Luke's telling, because he's not acting like the high priest. He's there abusing his power to abuse, using his power instead of upholding the law to twist the law for his own purposes. So it's this very clever device that basically says that the heart of who he is supposed to be is not evident to Paul, which sort of implies that God doesn't recognize him as high priest either. So here is that whole thing, repentant versus unrepentant Israel. The high priest, technically the head over all the house of Israel from the religious standpoint, is not accorded that kind of authority here in Acts. Rather, Paul is the one who is truly speaking out of the law and is truly speaking with righteous words. So just keep that in mind. That is clear. Paul's is not oblivious, but rather it is a device that carries a much deeper and much more resonant meaning for this entire passage than just, which one are you, the priest? A lot deeper than that. So then Paul is so smart in Acts. He looks around and says, Sadducees, Pharisees. And then he calls out, brothers, I am a Pharisee, a son of Pharisees. I am on trial concerning the hope of the resurrection of the dead. Well, what we've already seen, both from our knowledge of the Gospels and from what little we saw of the Sanhedrin earlier, that the Sadducees were the ones who were very hardcore pressed on denying anything regarding Jesus because they didn't believe in this resurrection business, among other reasons, that they didn't like the message from the apostles and now from Paul. Paul immediately, now that his speech has been cut off, basically starts to play the council against each other. And so he says this, a dissension begins between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and the assembly was divided. And then there's this parenthetical statement that says the Sadducees say that there is no resurrection or angel or spirit, but the Pharisees acknowledge all three. Luke's dropping this in case he thinks he's got some readers not familiar with the internals of Jewish politics, which probably the case that he's recognizing that there's a good number of Gentiles who are probably reading his work and don't know the intricacies of how all of this works inside of the temple. Well, we sort of know this, although it's interesting that it says the Sadducees don't believe in a resurrection, which we knew, or angels or spirits. Sort of odd, because if you read through the first 5 books of the Bible, the books of Moses, angels are mentioned a lot in those books, and the idea of spirit is mentioned quite a bit, including the very beginning of Genesis, the Spirit of God moved over the water. So it's sort of, again, doesn't seem like a very accurate or reasonable statement to make. What Luke probably trying to do here is to make the case and point that for the Sadducees, their religion is a this world religion, whereas the Pharisees acknowledge that there are forces beyond what can be seen, that God has at work that impact the way that good faithful Jews carry out their relationship to God, angels and spirits and resurrection, and that there is an afterlife, which the idea of an afterlife was developed by this time in Judaism, but only for the Pharisees. The Sadducees and most of the other sects of Judaism didn't really believe in that. When you die, you go to a place called Sheol, and your spirit rests in that place, but really is no more in the sense. There is no conception of heaven and hell. Pharisees, while it would be a stretch to say that they believed in the same heaven and hell concepts that developed in Christianity, but because they were influenced by Greek culture, that idea of the afterlife, there was a belief among them that when you die, you did go, there was a life after death, and it wasn't just everybody goes to Sheol. So here's Paul turning all of these people together, this worldly crowd versus the otherworldly crowd, and all through this, and then here comes the tribune, who peeks up again when he sees that there is a great clamor arising. The Pharisees then say, "We find nothing wrong with this man. What if a spirit or an angel has spoken to him?" And the dissension grows and becomes violent. The tribune, fearing that they would tear Paul to pieces, ordered the soldiers to go down, take him away by force, and bring him back to the barracks. Paul, again, ironically, finds safety within the barracks of Gentile soldiers, as opposed to the horror and the threats he's facing standing in front of his own people in this regard. So what is being portrayed here is within Judaism, there is this violent conflict that is taking place, which fits what has been going on throughout the book of Acts between those who are, again, here I go, broken record, repentant Israel versus unrepentant Israel. And for Luke, it shows that the hope of restoring everyone in Israel to the fullness of God's kingdom is becoming dimmer and dimmer by the day. It is simply for one to call those who are going to be repentant to come into the kingdom. And go back to what I said about Paul with a clear conscience. Paul speaks with a clear conscience from his perspective because, like he has said, I did not neglect to share the word. I am innocent in regards to the mandate to call and to warn my people of the goodness of God through Jesus Christ. And here he is standing in front of the Sanhedrin saying, I have done my job that God has commissioned me. Problem is they can't see that job or don't want to see it. They just simply see him as someone who is stirring up and wrecking from beneath this nationalistic ethos and theology of the people of Israel. And so the passage today concludes with verse 11, a vision. The Lord coming to Paul, it doesn't really say a vision, just stood near him as he's in prison in the brig of the barracks, And it says, keep up your courage. For just as you have testified for me in Jerusalem, so you must bear witness also in Rome. These visions come in moments of stress. They come in moments where it seems like there may not be a future line ahead, but indeed that future is articulated here. Your witness here in Jerusalem is going to lead you to Rome, which Paul had suspected and had known from previous knowledge of his prayers and visions he had received before. But now it's been confirmed again. Keep the faith, for you will go to Rome and proclaim my gospel to the churches there and to the Jews who were living there. So, gone a little bit over time, so I'll stop here. A lot in this passage, and it's really going to be a lot as we go forward. So, tomorrow's reading is Acts chapter 23, verses 12 through 24. So, I look forward to joining you with that tomorrow. In the meantime, the peace of the Lord be with you. See you tomorrow. Take care.